Excellent. So Del said almost everything. I just want to add that Ido is married to Julie. He met her in Los Angeles. She's native from Los Angeles. He has 3 children, not very young. They already adults, Talia, Shannon, and Adam. And he was 6 years the general consul in New York for Israel. He handled the biggest diplomatic mission outside Israel. So he has a lot of experience. Besides, he was a part of the negotiation group of people in Israel in 1993 when they signed the Oslo Accords. That is very famous. I remember when I was starting university and we saw in the news a lot of that, and they signed this treatment in the White House in September 1993. Ido, as we talk, we want to talk about entrepreneurship, innovation, and basically about national branding. I'm going to start with the first question. What do you think should be the role of the state, or the nations, and the public sector to create an innovation environment?
That's the $1 million question. We first of all, I wanted to thank you for this wonderful opportunity to talk to people in Chile and Latin America, and I know that we have people on the call from the United States. I actually prepared a few slides that I think will answer many of the questions. So why don't I run through the slides and then we can open the discussion? How about that?
Okay,
Adrian,
perfect.
Is that okay? So I will share the slides with you. And I titled this, lessons that I learned in the process of my work. And what I would like to do is basically talk about 3 things: the situation with COVID-19, a few lessons that I learned in the process of branding places, talk about a little bit about the case of Israel, and then open the floor. In many ways, COVID-19 is the perfect storm. It exposed the global leadership crisis. It exposed the systemic underperformance on the part of governments. To answer your question, governments are becoming less and less able of dealing with such crisis of such magnitude. So we were all exposed to governmental ineptitude all over the world, not only in the United States. Lack of preparedness, difficulties with decision-making in high levels of uncertainty, and of course, the information overload that enhanced anxiety rather than pacify anxiety. We don't know a lot about the future, but we do know that life expectancy is actually going to go up. If life expectancy in the United States early 20th century was around 62, it's expected to be by the end of the 21st century around 95. The social contract is completely distorted because of the change in life expectancy. We also know that most people, at least pre-COVID-19, were migrating into the big cities, right? In the United States, 80% of the population live in big cities of 100,000 people and above. And then we also know that the job market, as we know it, is going to be dramatically changed because of artificial intelligence, right? So COVID-19 is perhaps the point in history where we will see, as a result of the crisis and as a result of the economic devastation that will follow the crisis, we will see an inevitable clash. It's already happening in the United States. It will probably happen in other countries as well, and I hope it will not be violent. But there's a clash between 2 approaches. One approach that says the universe is trying to tell us something. We need to consume responsibly. We need to take care of the climate crisis. We need to engage in a more collaborative form of international relations. Businesses have to have purpose. Making money cannot be just the only purpose. And then the other approach, we'll call it the old order approach, will basically say, pre-COVID-19, we experienced an unprecedented prosperity. Let's go back to that. Let's take care of our own needs first. They will put the blame for COVID-19 on globalization. And we all know that global travel was the #1 agent of the pandemic. they will give rise to nationalistic and isolationism sentiments. And so this clash between the new order people, I call it the new abnormal people, and the old order people is already happening in the United States. The scenarios are very, very interesting. One scenario is that the world, or at least the world that we call it the free world, will be able to introduce a New Deal style reaction. The New Deal was the reaction of the US administration to the Big Depression of the late 1920s, early 1930s. And for 6 years, between 33 to 39, massive investment in infrastructure. The other scenario is a quick move to flex economy that is based on the ability to shift human resources from one sector to another, from hospitality and hotel to hospitals, for example, which is something that is very, very timely. It is also based on freelance economy, what we call gig economy. There'll be a big push to cashless and contactless payment services. And again, global competition will resume, but we'll have more of a collaborative format. And I can't even begin to tell you how important the November 2020 presidential elections in the United States are going to be to the fate of this clash that I'm describing between the new order people and the old order people. Obviously, Trump represents the people that say, let's resume the old order as quickly as possible because we had good times, and the new order people are telling him the universe was trying to tell us something. We better listen to what the universe, and so the results of those elections will have implications and repercussions way beyond the United States. A few things that I learned about the work that I did with brands, and here you can see a very famous quote that says the following: "No man ever steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river and he's not the same man." What does it mean? It means that change is the only thing in our lives that is permanent. And sometimes brands and countries have a tendency to avoid getting out of their comfort zone, right? History is filled with stories about brands like Kodak and like Fuji and like Blockbuster that were an Agfa, the Polaroid. They were very comfortable in their area, in their zone, in their business turf, and they declined embracing technology and embracing change. So the first thing that I learned working with a nation brand, in my case, I did work with Israel, but with other place brands as well, is that it's very, very dangerous to feel too comfortable about your performance, too comfortable about where you are. What is a brand? A brand is more than a logo. It's more than a slogan. It's more than just a campaign. If you may, a brand is unequal to a product or a place or an individual. Sometimes it's bigger, sometimes it's smaller. We'll talk about that. But a brand is the sum, the total sum of associations, emotions, experiences, and relevance linked to that brand. And the brand can be a person, it can be a place, it can be an idea, it can be a religion, it can be a country, it can be a county, it can be a city. To make it simple, a brand is a promise, right? The reason why when you still search on Google, all you have is that one search line. The reason is because Google is loyal to their brand essence. Their brand promise is, we will give you simplicity and efficiency. Now, Google is more than a search engine for a long time now. It's a company that is all-encompassing, yet in terms of their brand, they have not changed that one simple search line because it's about the DNA of what they stand for. This is their promise. The original promise Google has made is, we will be simple and efficient. And if you remember search engines before Google, if you remember Alta Vista, it was a barrage of text and images that really overloaded and overwhelmed the consumer. A strong brand, if a brand is a promise, then a strong brand is a promise delivered. I don't know how many of you had a chance to watch the Michael Jordan movie, The Last Dance on Netflix, but it's a movie about an athlete who delivered in a big way on his promise, which was to be victorious. United States is making a promise which is much bigger than its political leader. It's much bigger than Trump. It's much bigger than Obama. It's much bigger than Bush. It's much bigger than Clinton. The promise the United States is making to the world is it's a country where you are free to express yourself. The DNA of the brand is freedom. And the United States, and this is something that has nothing to do with politics. The United States today is the #1 engine of popular culture, and their national ethos of the American dream becomes gradually the national ethos of almost the entire globe. Here's an example of Israel. Tel Aviv is a city that never stops. Their brand promise is nonstop. Tel Aviv is working 24/7, is open 24/7, at least pre-COVID-19, and they live up to their promise. Brazil's promise. Brazil is, when people have a question, when people discuss Brazil, they usually discuss the fun aspects of the brand, like the beaches, the samba, the carnival. Very rarely people discuss the less fun aspects of the brand. And that brings me to the issue of place branding, and we can speak about brand Chile with pleasure. Some countries, like Brazil, enjoy from a brand surplus. What is a brand surplus? When the brand, the associations, the experiences, the expectations, and the emotions that people connect to the place is stronger than the place itself. That's a brand surplus. So Brazil is considered by many as a very powerful brand, but the product, the place itself, is not as powerful as the brand. We all know Brazil suffers from major systemic problems, inequality, poverty, crime, and so on and so forth. Most countries do not have, most places do not have the luxury of a brand surplus. Most places, like Israel, like Chile, and like most countries in the world, actually suffer from a brand deficit. What does it mean, a brand deficit? It means that the place itself is more attractive, more appealing than the brand. The product is better than its image. The product is better than the set of associations linked to the product. And how do you overcome that problem? Now, places overcome or attempt to overcome this problem by long-term managing their brand, trying to manage the way they're being perceived and the way they're being experienced, because you have to understand, a place brand is not just about image, it's about the actual performance of the place. So the reason why they're engaged in this long-term management of the brand is because they want to increase tourism, they want to improve trade ties, they want to improve the performance of their export brands, their leading export brands. They want to have more cultural exposure for their assets. I know that there are movies coming out of Chile now that are making a big impact all over the world. I think someone mentioned the movie Resistance to me. They want to increase the level of political support that will generate more goodwill for their foreign policy, and they want to engage in more global exchange programs. The rise of place branding has a lot to do with the end of the Cold War, when many new nations were created or recreated, with globalization, with urbanization, and with the rise of competition. How do places brand? They have to follow a very strict regimen based on 5 steps. They first have to conduct research, then they have to develop a strategy. Strategy is the overarching principle, which is the guiding principle. For example, in the case of New York, it's the principle of New York celebrating its diversity. In the case of Tel Aviv, it's Tel Aviv celebrating the fact that it's a non-stop place. Then you translate the strategy into an actionable, affordable work plan. You then implement it, and then you measure your effectiveness. Take the case of Kazakhstan. Everything went great for them until this guy showed up in 2004 and basically forced Kazakhstan, a nation of 20 million people, 24 times the size of Texas. 124 times the size of Israel, 4 times the size of Texas. He forced them into a situation where he single-handedly, with no budget, with no organization, rebranded the nation of Kazakhstan. Ask yourselves, do you know any other Kazakhi beyond Borat? Borat is the only Kazakhi that people know all over the world. And the question that we asked ourselves is, how did that happen? How could a person with no money, with no organization, with no budget, rebrand an entire nation against its will? And the answer, of course, was that Kazakhstan did absolutely nothing proactively to define its own image to the world. And that's a big problem, because then someone can come in, there is no vacuum in marketing, and rebrand your country for you. Now, we often have a tendency to confuse strategy with tactics. We often look at the task of branding Chile or branding Israel in terms of an advertising campaign or in terms of a public relations effort. And the truth is that you're looking at a never-ending effort, whereas campaigns and advertising can be one of the tools that we're using, but it's not about that. It's about the need to constantly manage all aspects of the brand, not just the image, the experience that people have with Chile, the performance of Chile, the performance of the place is part and parcel with the success. You have to conduct your own research. Places have a tendency to rely on other studies, on public opinion surveys. You have to define your stakeholders. Who are the people? My definition is always very inclusive. Every person who was ever touched by your place, whether they've been there or not, by the way. You can experience a place without being there. You can experience a place by watching a movie about that place. You can develop curiosity about a place without even being there. That's also part of the strength of the brand. This is why it's so important to conduct your own research. As I said before, it's more than a logo. It's a study. It's a deep study into the DNA of who are you, what makes you tick, who are the people of Chile, what is their legacy, what is their national ethos, what is the story that the people of your country tell themselves about themselves, and to what extent that story is relevant to the world. Performance first, as I said before, this is the case of Bilbao. Nation branding is not just about your image, it's about what you actually do. A lot of people think that in the realm of diplomacy, the task is to win debates. This is the model we call advocacy. This is what I was trained to do in the Israeli Foreign Ministry, and many of our brothers and sisters in the Jewish world still think that this is the task, to win a debate about who's right and who's wrong. But you know what? Winning diplomacy is the type of diplomacy that is not seeking a victory. Diplomacy and branding is about building relationships that matter, long-term relationships with people that matter. Why? Because at the end of the day, people react emotionally and not rationally. And you can ask the last 7 people that won the Nobel Prize in economics, and they will tell you. Be holistic. It's about the overall wellness of your place. Choose the across-the-board option, meaning it can never be just about tourism. It can never be just about trade. It can never be just about commerce. It can never be just about culture. It can never be just about politics. It can never be just about exchange. It has to be about all of the above and beyond that. A good brand identity considers the good and the bad, the plus and the minus. New York City chose the Big Apple because the Big Apple represents the temptation. Temptation can be very attractive and also can be very, very dangerous. In Las Vegas, the brand is what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. They're actually celebrating their deficiency or their perceived weakness. Effective strategy cannot be entirely aspirational. Let me give you an example. I was asked to work on a brand of one country in Asia that came up with the idea, and again, a campaign. They came up with a campaign, which is a big mistake, calling themselves a place of ingenuity. But they're not known for their ingenuity. They're not known for their innovation. So I told them, right now, you are not a place of ingenuity. One day you want to be, this is your aspiration. Now you cannot say to the world, I am right now what I would like to be one day. Doesn't work that way. You have to celebrate the assets that you have. In other words, your brand identity have to reflect a basic, simple truth about your place. It cannot be detached from reality. You can't say Israel is a place of tranquility. Yeah, sure, there are many peaceful places in Israel, but let me tell you, tranquility is not the brand. The brand is something else, and I'll show you in a second. Effective marketing cannot be self-congratulatory. Governments have a tendency to be self-congratulatory. They're very good telling you what they know they want to say to you. They're not so good studying the audience, trying to understand what is it that the audience is interested in. Therefore, the most effective marketing strategy for places is to use third-party endorsements. This is Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett, in the midst of the Second Lebanon War in the summer of 2006, invested 10% of his wealth in one Israeli factory. And that action alone branded Israel more than the work of 10,000 Israeli diplomats. So third-party endorsements. When I say Israel's economy is robust, is one thing. I'm being paid to say that. But when Warren Buffett is investing billions in Israeli economy, he's doing the work more better than anybody else, and in a far more effective fashion. Obviously, try to avoid politicization of the process as much as you can. One of the things that I discovered is the less credit you claim, the more credit you get, which is some things that usually politicians don't understand. Go below the line, meaning don't spend money on above the line advertising, embrace micro-targeting, work with niche marketing firms, seek partnerships all the time, try to leverage with the work of many institutions, try to create a wide coalition to try and advance the brand. This is what we did in Israel. And these are the areas of improvement that we looked at when we started with Brand Israel. And here you see the campus of Cornell and Technion on Roosevelt Island, which is one of the crowning achievements of the state of Israel in recent years. You know, we all try to study human behavior because we're all trying to predict human behavior. One of the big discoveries that we made in the process of Brand Israel is that the level of political support for Israel did not predict people's behavior. What does it mean? It means that people that said, yes, I support you in your struggle with your neighbors, did not necessarily have the desire to come and visit Israel. They did not necessarily have the desire to come and invest money in Israel. On the other hand, people that couldn't care less about the geopolitics of the Middle East were more inclined to invest money in Israel or more inclined to come and visit with Israel. In other words, the emotional connection and the quality of the emotional tie to a place is more important than where you stand politically. So I can agree with Chile, I can disagree with Chile, but once I go there and I develop my own connection to the place, I had a good time, I had good food, I spent time at the beach, I had your great wine, then I all of a sudden have a whole new set of experiences and connections to the place. It's more important where you stand politically. And Israel made the terrible mistake of branding itself to the world through the prism of its geopolitical hardships. And the price that we paid was very, very heavy. We did not attract enough foreign investments as a result. We underperformed when it came to tourism. Study abroad, we're underperforming severely. We're getting less than 3,000 students, where realistically Israel should be getting 50,000 foreign students every year. And the level of political goodwill on the part of the world is very limited as a result of the weakness of the brand. So what did we do? We decided to look at the 6 areas where Israel has a relative advantage: art and culture, high tech and science, environment, people and heritage, lifestyle and international aid, and celebrate Israeli creativity. What happened in 2007? The first smartphone was introduced and gave people the opportunity to design their own informational feed, and that actually gave that actually took the monopoly away from the people that mediated Israel to the world. And from that point on, gradually and increasingly, the Israelis and the people that experienced Israel started communicating Israel using their devices. And let me tell you, that's the main reason why Israel as a brand started taking off in 2007, 2008, 2009. We've had 8 consecutive years of groundbreaking record years in terms of incoming tourism. Of course, the book Startup Nation also did a great service. This book came out in late 2008. And for the future, you can see that we are expected to double our population in the next 30 years, which means that Israel is going to be, Israel is only at the beginning of the takeoff. This is, and I'll end my remarks with this slide right here. This is perhaps the most unique theater group in the whole world. I don't know how many of you had a chance to see them. What makes this group unique is the fact that the entire cast are people that are both deaf and blind. Now think about it. You're on stage, you can't hear, you can't see. How do you know when is your time to go? Well, they developed their own system of signals where they touch each other, and that's how they cue each other. So that's why the group's name is Please Do Touch. Imagine a theater group with people that sing and dance, and here you can see they even bake bread on stage, and they do it without the ability to hear, without the ability to see. To me, this is the story of Israeli innovation, because Israeli innovation goes way beyond high tech. Israeli innovation is present and manifested in all realms of life in Israel. It's about the refusal to accept limitations. It's about the permission to ask questions. It's about the ability to tolerate failure. Not every culture is willing to tolerate failure, but in Israel's case, failure is part of success. And I think these are the reasons that turned Israel into such an engine of innovation. So these are my slides. These are my opening remarks. And I'd love to take your questions, please.
Ido, thank you very much. You cover most of my questions during your presentation, but talking about the nation branding, we have several organizations in Chile. For example, here we have people from ProChile and we have people from Marca Chile. In your experience, how they should coordinate to have the same objectives and to have the same strategy, and who, in terms of what you said, it was the most important thing in terms of nation branding about the strategy, who should define the strategy of the country, and then all the other organizations work together?
So in some places, the strategy is organic. What does it mean, organic? No one person, no one agency, no one politician designed the strategy. It evolved because of the built-in organic advantages and qualities of the place, right? So Brazil is a perfect example, again, of a place that its strategy as a brand is about fun. Life in Brazil is fun. The Brazilian people are very, very life-loving people, good people. They're always smiling, and life is fun on the beach, and the samba, and the carnival, right? No one person, there's no agency that came up with that. It's a reflection of their climate, of their history, of their heritage, and so on and so forth, all right? So that's what we call organic brand strategy. Now, in some places, brand strategy is something that is designed, like in the case of Las Vegas. Las Vegas was actually founded by the Mormons in mid-19th century, but became the world's capital of gambling beginning of the 1950s and on, and it was designed largely by Hollywood. Paris, as the capital of romance, was branded by Hollywood. And I can go on and on and on and give you examples of brands that were created. Now, the first step is to conduct research. The purpose of the research is to find out what is the DNA of your nation. What is it? What's the one? Now, this has to be articulated into a strategy. The strategy is the lens through which you want to see everything. All right, so let me give you an example. If I said Germany to you, what would be the first thing that you will say about the German culture? Precision, efficiency,
Precision, time,
right?
efficiency.
Exactly. That's what I mean. That's the essence of the brand, right? If I will, I don't want to, go into too many examples, but there are many countries and nations that have a very distinct character. That character is that DNA that you're looking for. All right. Now, once you figure it out, then you have to articulate it. In Spain, they decided to take advantage of two things that they had. One was the climate, right? Very sunny. It's Southern Europe. The other was the diversity. Spain is about good food and good art and good sightseeing and good sports and so on. And they came up with a concept which was designed by Juan Miró that said, everything under the sun. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
It's a celebration of two things. Everything means diversity. The sun represents the climate. So they were playing on their two main relative advantages. This was based on research, and the research was meant to find out what is it that we can tell the world about Spain that the world will be attracted to. What is it that you can tell the world about your country that the world will be attracted to? That's the question. And then in order to do that, you have to conduct your own research, and you have to you have to study the people that live there, the people that left because they were disappointed, the visitors. You want to talk to their families. So if my daughter visited Chile, you want to talk to me. You want to talk to my daughter. And so the research has to be very, very, all-encompassing.
Thank you, Ido. I have some questions here. Dan Furas, a friend from Israel, he lives in Israel. Do you think the Holocaust had a big impact to the Israeli brand?
Yes. If the United States national ethos is the American dream, was a very powerful narrative. The American dream is basically, if you're willing to work hard and you're a decent human being, the sky's the limit. That's the American dream. Now, obviously, most people don't achieve the American dream, but it's a very good motivator, right? Now, in the case of Israel, because of the Holocaust, the national ethos of Israel is never again. And that changes everything. So the brand is about resilience, is about adaptability, because without adaptability, you cannot survive. And it's about survivability. That's why we chose a strategy that is hovering over all those elements, which is a celebration of Israeli creativity. You have to be creative in order to survive. In order to make sure that there'll never be a second Auschwitz, you have to be creative. So yes, the Holocaust has a lot to do with the DNA of Israel as a brand.
Thank you. We have a question from Mauricio Russo. He's a retail entrepreneur, member of the G100, and also belongs to the Jewish community here in Chile. I read the Startup Nation, and part of the success is about to have faced a lot of words and the shortage of almost everything. In Chile, we don't have a recent history of work, and we have a lot of resources. Can we do the same with so different a scenario?
Yeah, so a lot of people are looking for the secret sauce of Israeli creativity. And the truth is that Israeli creativity begins with the Jewish tradition. The Jewish tradition is all about the permission to argue. It's all about the permission to ask questions. Like I showed you, this theater group, they found a solution to something that seemed insurmountable. How are you going to take deaf and blind people, turn them into a functioning theater group? So it really starts with the permission, with the culture. In some cultures, and I say this as a teacher who's teaching students from all over the world, without going into examples, let me just say that there are some cultures where asking a question is impolite. Now, if asking a question is impolite, you can imagine how difficult it is to get innovation to become part of the DNA of that society. So the first thing I would say, it has nothing to do with your geopolitics. Your country, Chile, doesn't have to go through a set of military struggles in order to be able to nurture and facilitate creativity. You nurture and facilitate creativity through your educational system, through your culture, through your popular culture, and above all, through your national ethos. What is the story that you tell yourselves about yourselves? That's the key.
Perfect. Yael, how do you forge an entrepreneurial culture over the years?
So, as I said before, it starts really with the permission to study, to ask questions, to be self-critical, to be accountable. One of the reasons Israel, let me give an example, okay, to answer Yael's question. Just as in 1945, just as we in Israel, I wasn't born there, but my parents were here, just as the Jews that lived here pre-statehood were beginning to understand the scope and the magnitude of what had happened to the Jews of Europe and during the Holocaust, the Arab world decided to enact the Arab economic boycott against the Jews. And that boycott meant to suffocate the tiny economy that those 400,000 Jews that lived in Palestine at the time had. Imagine, just as we were during the weakest point in our history, the Arabs decided to do away with us. All right, this is 1945. Now you look at the countries that try to boycott Israel today. Where are they? All of them are lagging far behind in terms of GDP per capita, in terms of none of them is really interested in boycotting Israel anymore because they understand that Israel is different. What made it so different? The fact that we were all about accountability, meaning we took responsibility for our own actions and we took responsibility and we were self-critical. Without self-criticism, there is no human progress. Right? When you look at the countries around us, the universities are not at par with Israeli universities. There are hardly no innovation coming out of our neighbors. No innovation. And again, I'm not saying it because I think that they are unworthy economies or unworthy cultures. God forbid not. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying is that Israel was able to develop a culture of innovation through those elements that are well instilled in our culture. Being self-critical, being accountable. Two very, very important factors that are the main reasons why Israel is doing so well today when you compare Israel to those who tried to suffocate us in 1945.
Thank you, Ido. Nicolas Shea, he's the president of the G100. When you heard Chile, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
That's the first thing.
Long and narrow.
So long and narrow, the first thing that comes to mind is the geography because it's so unique. You have a very unique geography, the geographical layout, the mountains, and then I think you have probably the longest beach line in the world, right? There's no other country with more beach than you have. And then the other thing I think of is wine. I think of wine. But that's me, you know, I've never been there. I'd like to come.
You are invited to come when you want. Ignacio from ProChile, how important is to first share and communicate the strategy and messages of the country brand among the domestic audience?
That's the biggest challenge because societies have a tendency, especially in Israel, to be very self-centered. And one of the biggest things for me it still is, to convince the Israelis that the world is not interested in their arguments with the Palestinians. The world is more interested in what Israel has to offer them. So it's about being relevant, right? So relevance is actually a very good predictor for success. So if Chile is relevant to the world, let's celebrate that. right? What's relevant in Chile? So it's your food, it's your wine, it's your destinations, and in some cases, countries that have very strong academic foundation, it's also the innovation coming out of those countries. By the way, I forgot to mention before, innovation is tightly linked to the academic establishment. You cannot you cannot nurture innovation and creativity if you don't have a strong academic foundation.
Thank you. Maria from Image of Chile. Thank you, Ido, for your presentation. You mentioned place branding is about building relationships, collaboration. What would you say was the most successful strategy to bring together the public and private sector in order to build and promote the brand of Israel?
Well, the most important thing that we did was that we brought influencers to Israel, because Israel was communicated to the world through the eyes of a very small group of commentators and pundits and columnists and political leaders. And these people talked about the conflict because this is what they were dealing with. And so unintentionally, they defined Israel only through its geopolitical hardships. All right, imagine this. Imagine the mayor of Chicago holding a press conference every day, sharing with the public the success of Chicago Police Department fighting crime every day. And supposedly is a positive content, right? She's reporting about success of fighting crime. But the context of the press conference is crime. And what people remember is the context. Now, when you do that for 40 years, when the only thing you do with the opportunity given to you to talk to the world is argue with the Palestinians, then you become defined by that conflict. And the context of the conflict becomes the main thing. And so people lose the ability to know who you are and what really is your contribution. So my biggest challenge was to break that paradigm. And the way we did that is by bringing in influencers from all walks of life that put Israel on the map. Israeli food, Israeli wine, Israeli design, Israeli architecture, Israeli dance, and Israeli filmmaking, and also Israeli military, Israeli technology, Israeli medical breakthroughs, and so on and so forth. This was done through the influencers. And then when the Israelis were given the opportunity to communicate themselves, they simply communicated their own lives. And that's the most authentic thing that a country can do. Let the people communicate themselves to the world.
Thank you. Juan Pablo, Chile had a national branding in the 80s related with fresh fruit, good price, quality wine, fresh fish, etc. How would you suggest to connect that old strategy with modern concepts such as Israel is doing?
Well, I would have to learn more about the various sectors that you have in Chile and to understand more about your relative advantages. But basically, the methodology is still the same. Since 2007, the conversations are taking place in small niche hubs. Okay, so there's a conversation about food and conversation about wine, and we are surrounded by like-minded people, right? And ultimately, mainstream media is same, right? If you read the New York Times, more likely you're part of a very large group of people who are like-minded. If you're watching Fox News, same thing. And I suspect that the same thing happens in Chile. So the way to break that is by bringing those influencers to your country to experience those things, right? So you already have a very well-established reputation as a country that produces great wine. But there are other assets that you may have. There are other treasures, maybe other gems that you may have that the world is unaware of. Let's bring the influencers that specialize in those areas to experience the country for themselves. Let them be your multiplier. Let them be your amplifier. Let them be your ambassador.
Thank you. I want to make you, my last question is about the fourth revolution of technology that we are living now. This is something that makes me dream almost every night. You know that experts say that within 10 years, almost 50% of the employees gonna disappear because of robotics, AI, etc., etc., etc. I want to share you here. Bernardita, can you let me share the, because we are very intensive in Cooper, basically, and when you see the exports of Chile and Israel, you see that we have 50% Cooper. So we depend basically on Cooper, that is not very technologic itself. If you see how export Israel, you have mainly everything and a lot of things with added value. And then when you see venture capital that you can say that has a correlation with technology, the venture capital investment in 2019 was 257 billions. More than half was from the United States. Secondly, it was China, and Israel, with the size of Israel, was 8.3 billions. It's almost double than Latin America. And if you see the per capita venture capital investment in 2019, Israel was the number one in the world, was almost 1,000 US dollars per capita. USA was 416. And if you see Chile and Latin America, we had $3.68 per capita, and LATAM 7.31. So I believe if we don't transform our economies and we start building new industries, new technologies by ourselves, we're going to be out of the economy in 20 years. How you see that big change that we're living now?
Well, you know, I was born an optimist, and I'm very optimistic about that. For a very simple reason. The social contract that was designed late 20th century with industrialization and the need to take care of the rights of the workers has become obsolete because of the rise in life expectancy. What will happen with the introduction of AR and AI, artificial intelligence, is that it will also change the job market. I already alluded to it in my opening remarks about the switch to flex economy and gig economy. But try to imagine a world where having a job is not an aspiration of everybody. Try to imagine a world where career doesn't necessarily mean a job. People will have to make a living based on a skill that they have or a talent that they have, and maybe the purpose of life, like in ancient Greece, will be just studying. Or like during the days of the Renaissance, it will all be just about creativity. And you will, if you're talented in painting, that's what you'll do. And so we will have to change the way we think about work. We will have to change the way we think about what it means to make a living. And I think that COVID-19 is a wonderful opportunity to begin this conversation, because clearly, as I said before, the universe is trying to tell us something. The universe is trying to tell us that it's time to consume responsibly, that maybe we can actually live a pretty good life with less. We can live a pretty good life with less travel, with less consumption, and so on and so forth. So I'm actually very optimistic. If you look at how the world recovered from World War II, what happened, the recreation of the reincarnation of the League of Nations in the form of the United Nations in San Francisco, 1945, was actually, if you look at the original charter of the United Nations, very impressive document, very progressive, very inclusive, very forthcoming, very optimistic. That was the reaction of the world to the devastation of World War II. I think that we will see the same instinct. The world will respond positively once we will begin the recovery from COVID-19. And the problem, as I said before, with COVID-19 is not necessarily medical. It's the economic devastation. As I said before, Israel was not hit hard by the virus, but the economic devastation in Israel is as bad as in Italy or in the United States because of the lockdown, because of the isolation. So the virus is one thing, and the economic devastation is another thing. And the economic devastation is a huge equalizer. It's a global equalizer. And I think it will change a lot. So I'm very optimistic about the future. I think the future is in creativity. The future is in the creation of new knowledge. I think that societies that will spend more energy and time doing that are the ones that are going to have the edge. Societies that don't have the infrastructure and will fail in creating this infrastructure in the coming decades will be in deep, deep, deep trouble.
One of the last questions, because of the time, Karim, how important is the role of the government on supporting and subsidizing innovation and entrepreneurship? And how did Israel realize that the focus was on shifting towards strengthening and promoting this area?
So in Israel, we had no choice because we did not have natural resources. So in Israel, knowledge is the number one natural resource. And so we really had no choice, especially not after the Arab economic boycott. So we decided to develop markets elsewhere because we could not trade and do business with our neighbors. We had to go to Europe, we had to go to North America, Latin America, and so on. And then investing in universities. The government started subsidizing technology companies that came out of the universities first. No coincidence that the person who is the father of Israeli technology was a professor at the university in Ben Gurion, in the Negev. And it's no coincidence, because he saw that his students are coming up with those crazy ideas, amazing ideas. And he said, they need help. Who's going to help them? Who's going to give them the first $50,000? And so the government established, per the urging of that professor, this is like 45 years ago, the government established a fund called Yozma, which means an initiative. And they started giving seed money to those young companies that mostly came out of universities. Until this very day, you should know that 60% of the CEOs of all the startups in Israel came from Technion. Technion is not a big school. Technion has only 12,000 students. But 60% of the CEOs come from Technion. Shows you the impact of one university in Israel. So the government started seeding, giving money. And then that grew and grew and grew and mushroomed into what is now the Israel Innovation Authority, which is supporting hundreds of startups every year. So in Israel, there's a very long tradition of governmental involvement. In the United States, you have the same thing. You have money that goes into innovation through the NIH. You have money that goes into innovation through what they call DARPA, which is a secretive agency that develops all sorts of, in fact, DARPA is the place where the internet was invented, for example. And you have so many other governmental agencies that support all sorts of research, from space research to oceanography.
Thank you very much. We are almost in time. I write here one sentence you said: winning the diplomacy is not about winning or losing, it's about create relationships. That is another thing that we can talk another day, because we are struggling in Chile with the social movement that we have since last year. So Ido, thank you very much for your time. Very interesting conversation.
Thank you. And greetings from Jerusalem to all of you. And next year, you coming here.
We'll be there. Thank you very much for everything, and see you soon.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.